Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We're going to hear from two old friends of mine. Well, they're not old. They were young when I first met them, and they're married. So just so you know why they're sitting next to each other like this. But Payton Knopf was a Foreign Service officer at the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum. And when I was special envoy to Sudan for President Bush, he was my control officer, which means he managed me as I was in Sudan. And famously, he arranged a meeting with a notorious war criminal who has been indicted for genocide, Musa Hallel. I still don't know how, Payton, you arranged that meeting, but it was an eventful meeting. And I got to threaten him at the end, as you may recall. But he went on after being a Foreign Service officer, later was the executive assistant to George Mitchell when he was the envoy to the Middle East. And then he became deputy U.S. envoy to the Horn of Africa, I think to 2 different envoys. Is that right? Just one? Okay. And spent a lot of his career in the Middle East and particularly in the Horn of Africa. Kate Almquist was chief of staff at World Vision, the NGO. She actually is an Africanist. Her degree is from the SAIS, from the School of Advanced International Relations at Johns Hopkins. And I think your master's degree is in African Affairs, is it not? Yeah. So she went on without going into her domestic jobs. She was a senior advisor to me when I was envoy, when I was the head of AID. And then she was the deputy head of the Africa Bureau, which is a huge bureau in AID. But then after I left, she was promoted, I think, by Condi Rice to be the head of the Africa Bureau, the assistant administrator of the Africa Bureau. And then after that, she became the director of the U.S. Department of Defense's Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And in between, she was the AID mission director in Khartoum. So both of them have very extensive experience over 15 years now in Khartoum, and knew the leadership, knows what happened. And so we're going to ask the two of them to do a presentation here on what's happening, a little bit of the history of Sudan, but also what's happening right now and what the U.S. is or is not doing in the process. So, Payton, you're going to go first, and then you'll go back and forth. We'll talk for about a half an hour and then answer questions.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to say at the outset, thank you, Andrew, and greetings to everyone on the screen, some names that we know, and of course, all of the Scowcroft and Texas A&M friends and colleagues as well. So thank you for that. Andrew, it's been 20 years or more since your first trip to Khartoum as USAID administrator. And dare I say, since more than 20 years, almost going closer to 30 since my first time in South Sudan for World Vision. So scary how time goes, but over to Payton.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Andrew. And as Kate said, it's a pleasure seeing so many familiar faces and some new faces today. So, and I'll apologize in advance. I have a bit of a chest cold, so if my voice is a little hoarse, I'm sorry for that, but bear with me. So we thought we'd start with outlining a little bit of how we got here to this catastrophic war in Sudan that is really imploding the state with both dire humanitarian consequences, of course, but also very significant security ramifications, first and foremost for the people of Sudan, but also across the region and on both sides of the Red Sea. And as many may be aware, at the end of 2018, a popular protest movement that had been brewing for some time in Sudan gained steam. And first in Khartoum and elsewhere throughout the country, mass demonstrations erupted against the 30-year dictatorship, military sort of Islamist dictatorship that had come into being in 1989. And several months later, as a result of those popular protests, the longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir was removed from power by his own military, or rather by a combination of his own military and something called the Rapid Support Forces, which folks may be familiar with from all the press reporting as a result result of the recent war, but is headed by a Darfuri Arab named Hemeti in colloquial speak. So a combination of the RSF led by Hemeti and the Sudanese military removed Bashir from power and installed the Transitional Military Council, ostensibly to run the country in perpetuity. There was lip service given to the notion of elections, but not perceived, certainly by all the demonstrators who had gone out to great personal risk, not perceived by them as a credible commitment to any form of democracy. And the slogan of the revolution at the time was about democracy, peace, and justice, freedom, peace, and justice. And so the Transitional Military Council was not perceived as being responsive to that. So the demonstrations continued. In June of 2019, there was a massacre at one of the largest sit-ins around the military headquarters that had been going on for several weeks. It still is a matter of dispute as to who prosecuted the massacre, but many dozens of people lost their lives. And that accelerated and amplified the sort of calls for change. And I think the general perception, both in Sudan, among its neighbors, and certainly internationally, was that the country was on the precipice of a larger scale civil war. So there was an active international effort of which the U.S. was a part, alongside some of the neighbors, the UN and others, the African Union, to negotiate some sort of return to civilian rule with the Transitional Military Council. There had been, preceding that, a number of the reformist kind of political movements or politicians in the country, some of whom had been outside the country and returned after the revolution, others who had been inside the country agitating against the Bashir regime for many decades, had coalesced around sort of a plan for what they called a soft landing. So instead of expelling the military entirely from governance, which they believed could provoke a backlash and actually make it impossible to come up with anything other than a military-dominated government, they advanced a proposal for sort of a condominium arrangement between the military and civilian leaders. And as a result of that proposal and a lot of negotiations in the course of the summer of 2019, they signed what was called with the military, or with the Transitional Military Council, the civilian movement and sort of a coalition of political forces signed what was called the Constitutional Declaration. And the Constitutional Declaration, among other things, provided for a specific transitional governing model for a period of time, 2 years, if I recall correctly, to then lead to elections. And the idea was that there would be a civilian prime minister with a purely technocratic government, so not politicians. You would have a sovereign council composed of both military and civilian leaders, but chaired for the first 18 months of the transition, or for the first month of the first year, rather, of the transition, by the military as a way of according them some prestige and as I said, not provoking a reaction. And then you had a legislative assembly that was meant to be formed that would provide a forum for civilian participation in the government across multiple constituencies. Unfortunately, the transitional arrangement did not play out that way. In short order, you saw negotiations to deal with some of the simmering conflicts in other parts of the country lead to a peace agreement that was perceived as an elite deal with some of those armed groups, between the military, rather, and the RSF and some of those armed groups, that changed both the time frame of the transition and also the technocratic nature of the cabinet. And so bringing in politicians instead of technocrats. You also saw rising tensions between the civilian leadership and the military. And so in October of 2021, for a variety of reasons that perhaps we can elaborate on later, you saw a coup as a result of these simmering tensions, whereby the military leadership, meaning both the military and, I should say, the security leadership, meaning both the military and Hemeti, the head of the RSF, imprisoned the civilian cabinet, including the prime minister, a highly respected Sudanese economist who'd spent several decades working for the United Nations, and detained all of them and declared that they were in charge. You had not, and we'll come back to this, I think, later, the sort of third leg of the stool of the transition had been this legislative assembly that had never been formed. And so there had not at that time, and still not now, been a broader forum for creating a more inclusive political discourse in the country. So October 2021 was the coup. November 2021, the United States was instrumental in negotiating an agreement with the military to secure the release of Abdullah Hamdok, the prime minister, and subsequently the cabinet. Unfortunately, the conditions of that agreement more or less took Hamdok, who had become a sort of a figure of great prominence and support among the civilians. It was done in such a way as if it looked like he'd sacrificed the ideals of the revolution to essentially get himself out of prison. So it separated him from his political constituency, fundamentally eroding his own credibility. And so while he was released and restored to office on a temporary basis, the country continued to sort of spiral out of control. He had very little ability to control that or mitigate it, and he ultimately resigned in January of 2022. Between January of 2022 and the outbreak of this war on April 15th of this year, there was a UN African Union-led process designed to bring about a new political dispensation that would stabilize the country and, in theory, bring a civilian transitional government back into power. For a variety of reasons that I think Kate will elaborate on and we'll come back to as well in terms of sort of some of the failings of the international diplomatic effort to date, that did not succeed. In December of last year, this political process, or this UN African Union process backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other influential international actors, did yield a draft framework agreement, as it was called, that was supposed to then set the stage for further negotiations to restore a transitional government, deal with security sector reform, etc. Unfortunately, the issue of security sector reform, which has been, again, as we can talk about perhaps later, Kate will address, really the crux of the sort of failings of the Sudanese state, to the extent that the military, for many decades and certainly now, had dominated not just the security sector, but the political and economic life of the country. And unfortunately, this issue of security sector reform in the UN African Union process was left until the 11th hour. And there was a deadline set for early April to conclude agreement. And so rather than forcing compromise, what that deadline did was force an escalation of competition between the military and the RSF over who would be dominant in the country. And that ultimately exploded in the middle of April into the war that we have seen now, resulting in the near total devastation of Khartoum, genocidal violence in Darfur, the likes of which we've not seen since 2003, 2004, and certainly the period when Andrew was the U.S. special envoy, and as I said at the outset, the real disintegration, seemingly, of the Sudanese state. So with that, let me turn it over to Kate, who will elaborate for us the sort of consequences of this war, not just for the Sudanese people and for the region, but for U.S. Political and security interests as well.
Yeah, so the stakes, what are the stakes for what's happening now in Sudan? And I think it's important probably to step back and think about the geostrategic significance of the country, not just for us far, far away in the United States and externally, but certainly within the region and the more immediate neighborhood. And what are the stakes for the people of Sudan, most importantly, right? So just to rattle off a few quick facts and figures here, Sudan is a country of 47 million people. That's twice the population of Syria. If we want to think about other kinds of mega complex humanitarian man-made disasters of this sort. Sudan has an 853-kilometer coastline bordering the Red Sea, through which more than 10% of the world's trade passes and on which Russia keenly wants a foothold. It is home to the confluence of the two Nile rivers, right, meet in Khartoum. And we know that Egypt depends on the Nile for its own water security and considers it a very existential issue. There are significant gold reserves in Sudan, which has the attraction and the presence of the Wagner Group and business partner of the Rapid Support Forces. And there are several neighboring countries to Sudan, even in its smaller size since the independence and the separation of South Sudan in 2005. And pretty much every single one of those 7 neighboring countries is in some state of its own instability and internal strife, and in some cases also extreme fragility. In the capital, Khartoum, we haven't seen urban warfare of this nature, any nature, literally since 1885, if we really want to go back and dig into Sudan's history. So what's happening now in many ways for Sudan is unprecedented, even given its very long track record of civil war and conflict, as well as military coups. And so the level of physical destruction of physical infrastructure, as well as the flight of human capital, is really beyond anything that I've seen in the 20 plus or so years of working in and around Sudan and South Sudan. And I think for many Sudanese, just beyond their wildest imagination that this could come to their capital, never mind now to what's happening again in what's usually called the peripheries of the country. It will likely take decades to get Khartoum alone back to where it was on April 14th, right, the day before all of this started, given the level of sheer destruction even in that city. So we're just about a few days short of 5 months into this war, and I will use that word, war, between the two security forces. It's very clear that the Rapid Support Forces basically control the capital. The Sudanese armed forces do not. They have a few outposts, very important ones, strategic ones in terms of a couple of bases. Famously, if you're following the news a little bit, General Burhan, the commander of the Sudanese armed forces, escaped just in the last week or so from the bunker that he has been stuck in, essentially, since the outbreak of the conflict. But there are a number of very senior commanders still trapped in Khartoum, surrounded and isolated. And we think that President Bashir himself, who ostensibly was detained before this conflict, right, and imprisoned, that he is also somewhere within this situation. The Sudanese armed forces use their air power to attack and go after the Rapid Support Forces, who have the control of the ground in Khartoum. And between the two, civilians are endlessly caught in the crossfire. They're indiscriminately bombed, shelled, shot at, arrested, harassed, detained, tortured. The list of egregious assaults on the civilian population from each side, manifesting in some different ways based on the nature of their presence and control. But each side has really acted with wanton disregard for civilian safety, for international humanitarian law, for the preservation of infrastructure vital to the functioning of the city, of the state, of the nation, notwithstanding, a number of repeatedly broken commitments for humanitarian ceasefires. And so-called commitment to principles of civilian protection. Fighting has displaced civilians in Sudan in 8 of the 18 states, and we now have displaced populations across the entire country, leaving millions of civilians without supplies essential to survival. So we're talking about water, food, electricity, medical care, as well as intermittent telecommunications, transportation, banking services, et cetera, everything that, daily life depends on, both urban and rural. Disease, hunger, extreme gender-based violence compound the civilian casualties from those caught in the crossfire or directly targeted by the warring parties. Outside of Khartoum, the situation in Darfur and in another state called South Kordofan is particularly acute. This is where we see the most intense fighting beyond the capital city. And as Payton mentioned, in Darfur, we've sadly seen a return to the kinds of violence, the most heinous and barbarous acts of ethnic cleansing that we did see in the Darfur genocide in the early 2000s. That's been perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces and allied Arab militia largely against the African populations in these regions. In addition, there are intense battles going on between the RSF and the SAF for control of the capital cities in each of the states of Darfur. And in South Kordofan, we have an even more complicated dynamic with the presence of another non-state armed actor, a faction of what's called the SPLM North, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement that fought for the independence of South Sudan. A part of that faction that remained in North Sudan never signed on to the transitional arrangements that came about as Payton was explaining them post the fall of Bashir. That movement is now moving to assert some control to have a buffer, probably for the people of South Kordofan and its areas, but that's left the capital there in a very dire strait, as well as then ongoing fighting between SAF and RSF as well. We don't know the toll of civilian deaths. There are numbers that are put out by the Ministry of Health, so-called. Last number that was put out is that at least 6,200 people have been killed since April 15th. But we know from the many humanitarian reports and accounts of atrocities and other things that this has to be a gross underestimate of the actual excess mortality toll of this conflict. According to the United Nations, we're counting more than 5.1 million people newly displaced since April 15th. So in less than 5 months, over 5 million people have been uprooted from their homes. Just over 4 million of them are still displaced inside the country of Sudan. About 70% of those 4 million came from Khartoum state, just to, again, try and convey the severity of the crisis of the capital city. About 1.1 million Sudanese have crossed borders into neighboring countries. And that has been a fraught situation for so many of them who've tried those avenues of finding some safety and refuge and livelihoods. Prior to the conflict, there were already around 15 million, 16 million Sudanese in need of humanitarian assistance for a host of different reasons. Since this conflict began on April 15th, we're now tracking almost 25 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and 13.6 of those are children. And so that's a very dire situation as well. More than 20 million of them are in acute need of food assistance. And in fact, almost 3 million people are just one step away from famine level conditions. So it really is the most dire state across the board for the people of Sudan in decades. And that's counting some pretty grim realities of Darfur in the past, as well as the North-South conflict that displaced, we say the figures from that war were displaced over 4 million people, killed more than 2 million people. We don't think we're in that ballpark yet of deaths, but if this conflict doesn't stop, it's, I think, really horrifying to think about the potential ramifications for a country of this size and of this nature. So we are watching the collapse of the Sudanese state in terms of every sense that the modern nation state is supposed to function for its people. And in fact, not only is the state collapsing, but it is the elements of the state security itself that's eating the state, right? It's two warring state security forces literally destroying the country without regard for the civilian population caught in the middle. And that has, should have, we argue, profound ramifications, not just for the moral imperative to try and stop the bloodshed and try and assist the people of Sudan, but also for trying to find the diplomatic and political solutions to enable a state that does serve its people to come into being and to be a good neighbor in the region and beyond. So let me hand it now back to Payton to talk about some of those regional efforts and initiatives, and then we'll pick up on the international.
Thanks. So I think in the months since April 15th, when the war broke out, there have emerged 3 or 4 primary diplomatic efforts. I think it's fair to say two things about those efforts. One, they have failed to rise to the challenge, to be commensurate with the scale of the humanitarian crisis and security crisis that Kate just outlined, but also to be sufficiently responsive to the geopolitical implications of the disintegration of the Sudanese state for its neighbors on both sides of the Red Sea. Kate listed the number of borders, but it's also important, I think, to recognize that just across the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia, is Israel, is Jordan, who are also watching, and in some cases very deeply engaged in the issue because of their perceived the threat to their interests. And a number of these states are core U.S. security partners, and so therefore, obviously, it impacts our own security and political interests. So the first diplomatic effort to emerge after the war was one jointly led by the United States and Saudi Arabia, and representatives of the military and the RSF were convened in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, ostensibly to negotiate a ceasefire. I think nearly a dozen ceasefire agreements were announced as a result of that effort. Not one of them held for more than 24, 48 hours. There was an agreement on, in the first couple of weeks of what's called the Jeddah process, an agreement on humanitarian principles that the parties were meant to abide by to at least allow the delivery of much needed assistance. Those were not adhered to by either party. And so the Jeddah process has really struggled to deliver on its stated objectives as described by the United States and Saudi Arabia. So it was ultimately suspended as a result of that. There is a fair amount of speculation in the last couple of weeks and recent days that the Jeddah process will soon resume, perhaps with a slightly different format. Again, things have changed, as Kate said. The RSF has seemingly consolidated control over large swaths of Khartoum. At the same time, Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, his brother, who is his sort of closest advisor and sort of military partner, has also left the country and is sort of circulating in the region. Burhan, as Kate mentioned, is also out. So who is invited to participate in the Jeddah process, how it's structured, whether it brings in elements beyond just the two security actors remains to be seen. But certainly it's a process in which the United States and Saudi Arabia, at least, remain very deeply engaged. Critics of the process have noted that while the premise initially of trying to gather two states who did not have, were not backing one side or another, but had influence and leverage, together with the parties behind closed doors, could lead to a ceasefire agreement rather than a large and wieldy international process. It maybe was a sound premise, but the bottom line is it hasn't yet bared fruit. And critics of the process note that some of the states in the region, Egypt, the UAE in particular, one of the first of whom is backing and supporting, or had been, the Sudanese military, the second, the UAE, backing the RSF, were not engaged in the negotiations. So therefore, it was hard to see, if you didn't have the patrons of each side engaged in those talks, how any agreements would be enforced. The second initiative that was announced relatively early on as well by the African Union was put forward with sort of amorphous aims. The sense now is that it's really going to be an effort to convene a broad group of civilian stakeholders to talk about what they would see as a future political dispensation for the country and an end to the war. One of the challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss during the Q&A is that the civilian, in contrast to the sort of 2019 period when I noted earlier, there was a negotiation with the Transitional Military Council that resulted in a constitutional declaration where you had a sort of umbrella movement of civilian actors that could negotiate with some legitimacy. The civilian sector, the civilian sphere, has fragmented. And so it's very hard to find a cohesive body that can participate in the negotiations. There is a fair amount of skepticism among a number of the different sort of civilian entities and blocks and groupings about the AU being a unbiased partner, and the AU's commitment to the principles of the revolution, namely democracy and justice. So that's been a hindrance to the AU process getting off the ground, but we'll see in the coming weeks whether that also develops or sort of matures. And then the last effort, last two efforts, I should say, is one led by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is the regional bloc in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa, that encompasses these states. President Ruto of Kenya was a driver behind activating the IGAD as a forum for some sort of process to address the war. There's been challenges between Ruto and Burhan, Burhan is the leader of the Sudanese military, who disputed whether Ruto should be in charge of this process. There have been two IGAD summits to discuss Sudan, one in the early days of the war, and 2 days after the war broke out, three, another in July, and then one again last week, which has asserted what IGAD believes to be its primacy as leading the mediation efforts internationally. There's been a fourth effort then led by Egypt to convene what it calls Sudan's neighbors. And that's President Sisi of Egypt convened a summit in July as well, 2-3 days after the second IGAD summit. There appears to be a growing convergence potentially between the IGAD effort and the Egyptian effort, which could present quite a powerful group of states sort of frontline states, if we can use that word, who stand to actually face the most severe ramifications of Sudan's implosion. But what the details of that effort look like remain still a little bit unclear. And then on top of that, you have, as I alluded to earlier, a number of different initiatives by Sudanese civilians, political parties, a coalition of trade unions, various individuals, including the former Prime Minister of Sudan, Abdullah Hamdok, who was deposed in the coup, and who I mentioned earlier. So the question is whether those will coalesce into creating any sort of roadmap on a political way forward. I don't think that effort, and to some extent even the IGAD effort, is necessarily focused on a ceasefire, for example, and one could certainly contemplate a division of labor among these different efforts. But to date, none of them seem to have gelled into any coordinated, coherent, cohesive international effort. As I said, that sort of rises to the challenge. So maybe we'll use that as a segue into Kate's maybe closing remarks before we go to the Q&A on how we could do better.
Well, just some final thoughts here on maybe what's missing or what strikes us as some of the challenge of the moment, and looking at the prospect of the collapse of a state of Sudan's magnitude. It seems like it should be provoking new strategies, even new international architecture, to really understand and comprehend that the state just poofed. It doesn't exist, and not only does it not exist, what elements are left of it again is actively eating its people, if I can say it that way. And so, without really grasping that for both international peace and security, for the African peace and security architecture, as it's called, APSA, it does seem that the range of initiatives that Payton has just outlined, both within the region and a little bit more externally, including the United States, is not really yet commensurate with the kind of challenge that we're seeing, and the day-to-day devastation and destruction that just week by week gets exponentially worse in terms of the humanitarian numbers for the people of Sudan. One of the challenges I think that we have in this regard is there's a notion out there that democracy in Sudan, coming off the fall of President Bashir and with the transitional government and the hopes for a civilian-led administration. We can debate whether it ever quite got there, even before the coup, that was a Western project. And I think it really is imperative for all of us following along, and especially for those trying to help mediate and find solutions to really appreciate that democracy in Sudan is a Sudanese project. And the revolution that took place is a Sudanese revolution. And this generation, especially of Sudanese activists and citizens and society writ large, it's their thing, and we have to respect that and figure out, I think, better ways to put the weight that we can bring and the leverage that the external actors have really more meaningfully behind the people of Sudan. There's a lot of lip service to it, but I think, unfortunately, we have not delivered that from the start of the revolution on through to today, sadly. And so these security actors have taken full advantage of that over and over and over again. And so maybe if of interest, we can talk in the Q&A or the discussion time about what would that look like a little bit more. And we'll skip the sort of litany of examples there. But I think part of this to realize that is to really move past the belief that the security actors, either the leaders of the Sudanese armed forces or the head of the rapid support forces, sincerely ever meant to turn over power to a civilian government. And we have, I think, fallen collectively for that trap more than one or two times now in this process for Sudan in the last couple of years. And without any meaningful application of leverage, of some way of changing the calculus of these belligerents. And I'll just note my own personal pet peeve that it is more than just the two warring generals that we're talking about here. There is a whole political economy behind each of these forces, and what's inspired and motivated and driven and continues to compel them to continue this fight to the death. It's beyond just a personal rivalry between two men. So we must figure that out, take note of that calculus, and find ways to adjust it if we ever want to see a meaningful ceasefire and an end to the active hostilities that are coming about. I think part of that as well is for the West on our side and for African counterparts and stakeholders here within the region, to make clear that there can be no legitimacy for a regime that has taken its country to this place. And so we see the Sudanese armed forces, the SAF, actively trying to promote itself as the government of Sudan and falling into that trap of giving it an even nominal legitimacy to be referred to that way, to negotiate humanitarian access in that sense, to treat it as somehow the sovereign representative of the people of Sudan is one of the challenges and the pitfalls, I think, of present mediation efforts. And something that requires a lot more soul searching and perhaps, again, some new innovation in terms of our response mechanisms for how do we navigate in such a situation where we really have no legitimate actors on either side. We have two warring parties at least, sometimes a few more than that in a couple of parts of the country. And yet we've got to find ways of supporting the people of Sudan, of getting assistance of resourcing those on the ground, most importantly, who are fighting every day to try and care for people. And that requires programmatic innovations for the USAID colleagues on the line. That requires political innovation in terms of our bigger architecture and our sort of toolkit of normal mediation responses. And so for all of these reasons, it does seem that we haven't really risen to the challenge yet as the United States. We think about the broader context on the African continent and internationally right now, and what's going on between the so-called great powers et cetera. It really behooves us, I think, as the United States, and this being a country that we've had a deep and abiding commitment to in Africa, testimony to Andrew Natsios himself and all of his years of work and many others across administrations, to help give the people of Sudan and South Sudan their opportunity for freedom, and to be a support and an enabler if possible. And all of that has been wiped away suddenly, rather quickly here. And so how can we do better for the people of Sudan, and how can we give meaning to the partnership that we express from the United States government with Africa at a time when we want Africa to stand, for some of these same values in other parts of the world. And so that beyond just the day-to-day existential reality for Sudanese, there are, I think, broader implications for the United States and for how sincerely we can project our own soft power, if I can say it that way, if we fail to really be there for the people of Sudan. And, for Africa as well, there are a lot of very laudable principles and values embedded within the African Union's Constitutive Act and within its own peace and security architecture. But if we see genocide return, we see collapse of the state in this magnitude on top of the proliferation of coups and the challenges of state failure in some of the other parts of the continent. I think that too is cause for some deep soul searching for where are we in terms of the functioning of the state system and of our regional and international architecture to really live up to what's required to protect and care for people on our continent and more broadly. So Andrew, we'll maybe pause there and allow to move to questions and whatever is of most interest. Sorry, we can't hear you.
I think you're muted, Andrew, maybe.
Sorry about that. Let me ask a few questions that occurred to me that some of our listeners may also want to know about. And that is where the Wagner Group is. I understood that they had bases north of Khartoum. And at one point they were arming Hemeti, but then they were also arming they're arming the Sudanese armed forces because they're not sure who's going to win. But I don't know whether that's the case now. Since the head of the Wagner Group was executed or had an accident, however you want to see it, the Wagner Group itself has collapsed, but other military, paramilitary organizations are sort of taking control of the Wagner empire in Africa across the Sahel. Are they still active? What are they doing? And I understood that they were trying to negotiate a base agreement to use the port of Sudan for the Russian Navy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. There are other, you included, Andrew, who are far better placed to discuss sort of Russia's interventions in Africa than I am. But with that caveat, and certainly given the uncertain situation after Prigozhin's death, but with that caveat, I'll say a couple of things. I think there has been, as you said, I think both the military and the RSF have had various engagements since the revolution with the Russian government and with Wagner that are cause for concern. And I would note that on the day that Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, Hemeti and several members of the cabinet, because this was prior to the coup against the civilian prime minister, Hemeti and several members of the cabinet, some of whom are aligned now with the military, were sitting in Moscow, having just met with the Russian foreign minister. And one thing that continues to surprise me about that is that I'm unaware, actually, of any sort of group of individuals or an individual specifically who was so blatantly associated themselves with the Russian aggression against Ukraine and faced no sanction from the international community as a result of just, or no sanction from the United States, I should say, or from the West, as a result just of that affiliation with the Russian invasion and obviously, all of the gross violations that followed. There's also been, though, as you said, a number of discussions between the Sudanese military, again going back to the early days of the sort of post-Bashir period, about potentially a base on the Red Sea and other issues. I think it's in many cases, not the first instance when dealing with Russia, it's been, I think, challenging for me and a number of others who follow Sudan very closely to sort of wade through what is rumor and innuendo and what is fact. I think it's also probably fair to say that both the military and the RSF, some of their engagements with the Russians and Wagner were performative for the West in order to sort of induce a certain discussion with Washington or other Western capitals. And I mean, as Kate said, in some ways to sort of try to kind of create a little bit more willingness to go along with the military, lest we lose them to the Russians. I think the key point here is that, you know, I'm not aware, with a few exceptions, there have not been, you know, the sort of civilian constituencies that were on the forefront of the revolution, on the forefront of demanding, as we said earlier, freedom, peace, and justice, are not tempted by an alliance with the Russians. So to Kate's point earlier, I think if we think about what a more stable internal dispensation for Sudan looks like, which is a civilian-led dispensation, it's also a dispensation that is in the geopolitical interests of the United States for reasons that have nothing to do with Sudan, but in terms of our equities elsewhere, whether it's defending Ukraine's sovereignty and pushing back on Russian aggression there, or in other parts of the world. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
Okay. So do you know if the Wagner Group is active in the civil war right now? Or do we know?
It's not. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No. I mean, it's not clear. I mean, there's a little bit of a fog of war situation. I must say that I have not seen significant evidence of a significant role of Wagner now.
One of the arguments I've heard is that none of the outside forces are really clear on who's going to win. And they're not, they don't care whether it's democracy or not. What they care about is having influence in any post-Civil War power structure. That's what Russia's worried about, China's worried about, the Saudis and the Egyptians are worried about. We and the Europeans are more focused on these larger issues of civic involvement in a civilian government and all that. But let's go back a little ways as to what caused all of this, because a lot of these civil wars have roots that long predate the actual events themselves. Max Weber, the great German sociologist who famously wrote about a lot of conditions that exist now in the world, he wrote in the 30s and 40s. He said once that one of the conditions of a sovereign state is to have a monopoly on the control of violence, being the police and the military should have a monopoly on the use of violence to contain war and to protect the country from, not to protect, the police should protect against the criminal elements by having a monopoly of the control of violence against the criminal elements, and then the military to defend the country. In this case, there are two militaries. There's the Rapid Support Force, which has its roots in the Arab Legion that goes back to the 1980s. And then there was its successor in the commander of Musa Halel, the notorious war criminal that you and I met with when I was the envoy. Hamedi is Musa Halel's successor. They are responsible for the death of at least 300,000 people in Darfur. These people are not simply a rebel group that was taken over. They are responsible for mass atrocities, and the International Criminal Court indicted them for genocide. Hamedi is the commander of this. It's very difficult to assume the United States is going to negotiate with these people, given what their history is. So the question is, what are the structural weaknesses in the Sudanese state that led to the current situation. How did this happen? Not. I don't mean in terms of a series of events, but just in terms of the structure of the country and the system.
Well, Payton will come in here, but just to further note, Andrew, that Hemeti really and the Rapid Support Forces were formalized, I think, as a structure a little bit after our time on the file, but by President Bashir, really to contain in some ways Musa Halal out in Darfur, and Payton and even others I can see on the line here who are more expert can come in on some of that. As well as President Bashir used them for his own, regime security. So Bashir brought the RSF into Khartoum, right? And then Hemeti turned on him when this popular revolution happened, and he joined forces with the SAF commanders, and they decided together to remove Bashir, and that was the first coup, and then the second coup against the civilian part of the transitional government in 2021.
So in fact, the Sudanese state has created the conditions.
Yes,
absolutely.
So, but I'm gonna let Payton comment.
Well, no, I mean, I think you have it there, but I mean, this is where Kate said earlier, I mean, the state is eating itself, right? This is not a case where you had a sort of rebel movement come and storm the capital, and so that is a bit, there obviously, as you know better than anyone, Andrew, there's been a long history in Sudan of armed opposition movements challenging the center for whatever reason. But this is a very different war in that sense. And but structurally, maybe just to briefly answer your question, I mean, the fundamental issue and one of the animating points of the revolution was that you have, whether it was the Sudanese military or the combination of the Sudanese military and the RSF, you have not just the security sector, but the political and the economic sector of the country dominated by the security services, if we can call them that generally, which are controlled by a small group of individuals whom divide the spoils of the country among themselves at the expense of the broader population. It was particularly acute in what are called the periphery areas of Sudan, certainly. And up until this war, Khartoum was, unaffected by that level of predation. I don't want to exonerate the abuses that were suffered by the people of Khartoum, but the scale was certainly higher in somewhere like Darfur and elsewhere over the years. But now you've seen the real acceleration of that dynamic, where predatory impunity essentially is what the vast majority of the population is now enduring, and it's impunity at the hands of essentially what are officially the security services. I mean, even the Constitutional Declaration of 2019 acknowledged a formal role for the RSF in the security sector, and for Hemeti in the governance of the country and in the security services of the country, above and beyond the role that Bashir, as Kate said, accorded the RSF when he was still in power. So
there's another question here: is the power of Sudanese civil society? Because this business that this is a Western imposed thing, I agree with Kate, is nonsense. Civil society in Sudan has been more highly organized on a Sudanese basis that goes back to the independence in 1956. The Sudanese Lawyers Association, or the Bar Association, the Sudanese Doctors Association, the Sudanese women's groups, other civil society student groups. Those four groups were at the heart of taking down Bashir, but they also took down Numeri in the 1980s through mass demonstrations and in previous military dictatorships. Sudan, unlike Egypt, for example, has had periods of civilian rule by democratically elected governments with multi-party democracy, where the elections were reasonably clean. They didn't include the Southerners, But in terms of this, this is before the South became independent. But they have had elections. They know what a parliament is. A lot of countries in the Middle East have no history whatsoever of democracy, real democracy at all. And so they are very well organized, and I might have the political figures and the military are afraid of them, which is not the case in many countries. So there is another factor here. You mentioned it, but I want to emphasize it. The Nile River Arabs in the Nile River Valley, which is Khartoum, the Nile River, Kate mentioned it, is the Blue Nile and the White Nile. One arises or is sourced in Ethiopia, the other in Uganda. They meet in front of the presidential palace in Khartoum. You can actually see one is blue and one is white, literally. And they meet and then they move along to the north into Egypt. Without Egypt, without the Nile River, there is no Egypt. 120 million people in Egypt will cease to exist if the Nile River stopped, because they live in a desert and the only water they have is from that river. So Egypt's stability is entirely dependent on what happens to that river. The Sudanese have built 4 small dams north of Khartoum. The Egyptians agreed to it for flood control reasons, but there's now a huge dam being built, the largest in Africa, in Ethiopia near the border, called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That will be, it's absolutely massive. It's 89% done at this point. So there are water issues. There are the power from that dam will be able to light all of the East Africa. East Africa could be stable again. So the Nile River Arabs have dominated Sudan, and I show this in my history of Sudan that was published 12 years ago. Not since revolution. They've dominated the country since the 1830s with the arrival of the Egyptians in Sudan. Without going into the details of this, and one of the issues that caused the South to seek independence was the periphery suffering deprivation and poverty when all the resources were in Khartoum. But that's also what led to the rebellion in the Red Sea Province, and in Darfur. So the periphery of the country in the north and the south has been in revolt for 40, 50 years. The disparity in wealth between the Nile River and the rest of the country is like 13-1. In the United States, by the way, it's like 2-1. In China now, it's 10-1. When you have that disparity in wealth between different regions of the country of this massive size, you're going to have huge resentment and anger and obvious inequality, just in terms of public services, for heaven's sake. And so Greater Khartoum was a middle-income country because of gold wealth, but particularly because of oil wealth. The rest of the country was the poorest areas in the world. And so I think it's fair to say that disparity in wealth is one of the things that caused a movement in the South and in the West and in Red Sea Province toward the central government in Khartoum. Is that unfair to say? And would you comment on that?
No, go ahead.
Well, I don't think that's unfair at all, Andrew. And I think, beyond just the economic wealth and disparity, right, the periphery or the non-center of the country, if we could say it that way, because we're really talking about everywhere except for, this privileged area around Khartoum, essentially, and nearby along the Nile River. It's not just economic wealth; it's the whole functioning of the state, right, and delivering public goods to people. That there are certain segments of Sudanese society that have benefited from their state, even during the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, and some of the ups and downs before that politically, and then huge parts of the country have never benefited from the state, right? So not just the southern Sudan that, did ultimately choose to succeed for those reasons, largely, but still parts of present-day Sudan where the state has never worked for its people, economically, politically, security, most importantly. And so there are a whole host of complex array of factors and microcosms of complex conflict issues and fault lines underneath what is now happening at the macro level of these two warring, security forces.
So is the USAID mission functioning in Khartoum now? Is the U.S. Embassy functioning, or are they evacuated?
No, they've completely evacuated. The U.S. aid mission is sort of operating on a temporary basis out of Nairobi, where we are, and the embassy has not yet been reconstituted outside the country. But I mean, you'll remember, Andrew, of course, there were a number of years where the U.S. embassy was based in, the U.S. embassy Sudan was based in Nairobi. I mean, during the sort of 90s and part of the Bashir periods. Sadly, there's precedent for this, but no, there's no, and in fact, most of the humanitarian, whether it's UN agencies or international humanitarian NGOs, very few of them, I think at this point, it's really just the ICRC and MSF. The Doctors
describe those: the International Committee of the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without
Borders. The Doctors Without Borders are the only two international NGOs who can operate in Khartoum. There are other operations in other parts of the country. There are some operations in Darfur, but the people of Khartoum have really been, they're really on their own at this point.
What's the do we know anything about the inflation rate in the markets of food? Is it very high?
I think it's off the chart. I don't think there's been updated analysis that I've seen. I think the sort of IPC, the integrated food, the food security rankings and classifications don't have very good data these days.
So we really don't know what the level of economic collapse is. The best way of ending any conflict is to have the actors do it. The North-South peace agreement, we helped facilitate it, but Garang and Bashir ultimately agreed to a legitimate process, what ended in the comprehensive peace agreement, 125 pages. They negotiated. We simply intervened when there was a dispute that couldn't get resolved, and we encouraged them in certain ways. We were observers, not the directors. And so that is a way to go. The problem is a lot of people are probably dying, waiting for that process to play itself out. One other comment, and that is, this is not a high priority for the U.S. government because of what's going on in Ukraine. But what I tried to do when I asked the question of whether Wagner is involved or not, and what the Russian intention and the Chinese intention is to use Sudan as a base of support for their control of the Red Sea. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. That's where the Suez Canal controls a huge amount of the world's commerce, and I might add food supply. And we're allowing the Russians to have influence in Sudan. I don't think we should just look at this as a humanitarian issue. It is a geostrategic issue in great power competition that can affect the sea lanes of the world in a profound way. And
exactly right, Andrew, and that's why it's a bit shocking. The moral imperative aside, that we haven't moved towards more what Jason has said, that we're still stuck on starting with the security actors, as if we can't work around. They're there, so we have to deal with them. We have to concede that they have political and economic control, rather than telling them they have to get back in their security box. Right. If they're going to be the Sudanese armed forces, if the RSF is going to deliver some security good for the people of Sudan, and I'm making a comment on whether that should or should not be the case. I think they've probably exhausted any possibility of that with their egregious behavior, not just in the last few months, but even during this revolution process. Never mind, the very tragic history of Darfur, but whatever, Hemeti wanted to aspire to in terms of being a security leader, an economic leader, a political leader, whatever the leadership of the SAF, not just General Burhan, but more collectively the leadership of the SAF aspire to in terms of the politics.
SAF is the Sudanese Armed Forces.
Yeah, the Sudanese Armed Forces, sorry, SAF for short. We act as if we're stuck, and we have no levers, no way of changing their calculus or of confining them back to their security space, and empowering the civilians and the grassroots initiatives to define what does democratic governance, accountable governance, at least to the people of Sudan, look like for the people of Sudan.
Well, we're now at the end of our time. Someone asked if we could do the same thing in Ethiopia. We're going to have Alex DeWall speak. I'm not sure the date yet, but Alex is an expert not just in Sudan but also Ethiopia. So he will just talk about the world food system and the severe stress it's under right now, but also on Ethiopia that's coming up. Kate and Payton have done a wonderful job in telling us what the current situation is. So thank you for being with us from Nairobi, I might add, from Nairobi.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely to see you.